Welcome back. We are moving to China, and Dandin in China is the title of our next talk. And the next speaker, I will say, we don't say, Victor Mair needs no introduction for anyone doing Chinese literature in general, and for those of us who are interested in the Indian impact upon Chinese culture and upon Chinese literature. He is really the expert. So please, Victor.
Okay. Yeah, I don't need that. Well, I'm very happy to be here. I almost didn't come because when Igal first invited me, he will remember, using the figure of Abeksha, I said no because I'm not an Indologist. And he said, we especially need people like you who are not Indologists, but know something about Dandin. I said, I don't think so. Nothing new to offer. And then Igal wrote back, but we need to hear from you. And you might be stimulated to make some new discoveries, fresh discoveries. Now, in the ancient Chinese tradition, if a ruler asks someone, a scholar or a general, to come and work for him 3 times, so I was impressed by Igal's earnestness and his sincerity, and I really couldn't refuse a 3rd time. So I said yes, and now that I'm here, I'm very glad that I did say yes, because of the visit to the archaeological sites on Sunday, which was amazing, and the incredibly fine papers and discussions that followed on Sunday, and then that magnificent Sarod concert by Tom. That was quite an experience. And fantastic Havruta last night, led by Charlie, which was an incredible experience too. And excellent food all the while. So I thank Igal for being so patient and gently persistent with me. After I agreed to participate, I wasn't sure what I'd talk about. So I told Igal, mere metaphor for Chinese literature, as a tentative title. Couldn't go too far wrong with that. And I may actually say a few words about that later on today. But after hearing the other papers, however, I think that I need to adopt a broader overview and provide a more comprehensive approach to the spirit of Dandin in China. And I'm pleased that Shanghai, where is he? Yeah, I'm pleased that he will be following my presentation because he will be explaining the technical details of doshas, alamkaras, and so forth. I think so. That leaves the more general and theoretical issues for me to handle. Before I embark on that task, however, I need to tell you how I got involved with Dandin at all. In other words, I want to explain the genesis of my big project on the role of Sanskrit poetics in the history of Chinese literature. And here I must begin by mentioning the name Mei Zulin. You'll hear me talk a lot about him. He's a giant. He's a professor of Chinese linguistics at Cornell. He's been retired for about 15 years, I think. And this all happened back around 1980. From his close reading and analysis of Chinese poetry, dating from around the 2nd century to the 10th century of the Common Era, during which time a tremendous transformation occurred that resulted in the codification of prosodic rules for what became the premier form of Chinese verse. Zulin was convinced that these fundamental changes were due in large measure to the impact of Indian phonological treatises and canons for the writing of poetry that came along with Buddhism during that period. This was Meizulin's intuition. The resulting type of verse was called regulated verse or recent style verse. It's on number 2 on your handout. Zulin is a man who often has brilliant insights, but they're always based on a lot of firm background reading and analysis. He's an extraordinarily fine Chinese historical phonologist, but he didn't know anything about Indian language literature. As we would say in Nepali, ke garne, zamaban in Chinese. What could he do? I don't know how you would say that in Hindi, but it must be something like ke garne. What to do? So here's how things transpired. Zulin knew that many of the rules for the sweeping changes that occurred in the writing of Chinese poetry during the early medieval period were codified in an extremely important corpus of works that were preserved in Japan but lost in China, where they had originated. This was the Wenjing Mifu Lun in Chinese, the title of the same text pronounced in Japanese, which I'll use today mostly, is Bunkyo Hifuron. 2 salient facts about that collection. It was published in 804, and it was taken back to Japan by a very famous Buddhist monk named Kukai, esoteric Buddhist monk. So that gives us a date, and it gives us connection with Buddhism. Now, the date doesn't mean that these texts that it collects, there are a whole bunch of texts that are in this compendium, that they are from 804. They're obviously from earlier period, and he brought them from China to Japan. They're Chinese texts. And most of them are just full of the stuff that you've been talking about here for the last few days, that we've been talking about. So this is an extremely important collection of texts. And like many very important literary monuments in Chinese literary history, lost in China, but preserved in Japan or in Mongolia or in the Gobi Desert or in caves in Central Asia. So this is one of these key monuments of Chinese literary history that did not survive in China, but fortunately survived outside. So, what does the title mean? Number 5, a treatise comprising a mirror for literature and a repository of rare verses and expressions. Does that sound suspiciously familiar? Okay, so Wenjing Bunkyo means kavyadarsha. It means exactly the same thing. Mifu or Hifu means kosha, a treasury or storeroom repository of fine words, verses, sentences. In the context of poetics, that's exactly what, if kosha means that, that's what Hifu means. Secret treasure house, it really is saying. And then the last word, ron, it means shastra. And it is actually very often used as a translation of the Sanskrit word shastra. To keep to the promise of my title, I'll try to say more about the mirror metaphor in Chinese literature later in this talk. Or you can remind me to do so during question and answer period if I forget or if I run out of time. But I do have some important things to say about the mirror metaphor. So here was Meizulin with the Bunkyo Hifuron on his hands. he just knew that it held the key to regulated verse prosody, first of all, and that it was full of Indian ideas, second of all. Maizulin knew this from his own intelligence. But he also realized that he couldn't handle the Indian side of things by himself. So, like all good professors, he commanded one of his graduate students to write a PhD dissertation on it. Sort of. And that was Richard Bodman, who was the son of probably the greatest Sino-Tibetan linguist at that time, Nicholas Bodman. So Richard Bodman was a Harvard undergrad. His dad was a Cornell professor. And Richard Bodman went to study with Maizulin at Cornell, Maizulin was the most important Chinese linguistics professor in the country at that time. So Nicholas Bodman wrote his PhD, and he made a lot of progress, and his PhD is definitely worth everybody in this room reading if you have any interest in the Bunkyo Hifuron. Because the Bunkyo Hifuron is also like a repository of Dandinism in Sino-Japanese world. So, but Richard Bodman didn't know any Sanskrit, and he wasn't able to go forward in that direction. Although he made available certain sections of the Bunkyo Hifuron in English translation with a lot of good annotations to Chinese literature. Well then, Maizulin is also a stubborn person, or a persistent person, so he's not going to give up. His prized pupil did not succeed in elaborating the Indian side of the Bunkyo Hifuron. So the next thing Maizulin did was go around approaching all the great Sanskrit professors in the world at that time, certainly in America. So he went to see Daniel Ingalls, talked to Daniel Ingalls, Van Buitenen at Chicago, and practically everybody else who were leading Sanskritists. And they all said, "I'm sorry, don't know anything about Chinese, I can't help you." And then he finally asked the formidable George Cardona. And he's the pièce de résistance of all Sanskritists. I know, because even though he's like this tall, he is tough and very smart. And you don't want to tangle with him. So George Cardona said, well, I have to say, in those days, I had just come to Penn. I left Harvard to go to Penn because Penn had the greatest Indology program, and I wanted a place that had good Indology. And what a thrill to be at Penn in those days. Those were the glory days. We had this, every Wednesday, we had a South Asian seminar. And probably a lot of Patrick was there, but most of the great Sanskritists in the world paraded through there. Over the course of a few years, you could meet them all. And it was just amazing to sit there. And I'm a Chinese professor, but I would go because it was so great. The room was always filled with about 100 people every Wednesday at noon. And so George got to know me because I went to those seminars, and I said something once in a while. I dared. And so he said to Maizulin, "Why don't you ask Victor Mair? He knows something about Sanskrit, and he knows something about Chinese." Well, I did know something about Sanskrit because I had taken Sanskrit. And I knew something about Chinese because I was teaching it. But I knew next to nothing about Sanskrit prosody and poetics. So what did I do? Maizulin put this to me, and I thought, hey, this is interesting. It'll give me a project for the next 10 years. And and it'd be great to work with Meizulin. So I said, okay. So what I did was check out every book in the Penn Library on Sanskrit prosody and poetics. And I had fun reading them. I really didn't know anything about Dandin, nothing about poetics. But I spent 2 years reading these books, and then Meizuli and I started getting together and knocking heads over this. And we worked together for about 10 years. And I would go up to Ithaca, he would come down to Philadelphia, we'd meet at AAS meetings. And that was in the day before computers and email. So sending stuff back and forth meant mail and writing by hand and typing. And you know, probably to this day, Meizulin still uses corrasible paper on a typewriter. You know what corrasible paper is? You just use your pencil eraser and you can erase on a typewriter. That's still how he works. Always like that. And it smudges. So I start to know what Natya Shastra is. I started to know what Bamaha's Kavya Lankara is. And of course, Dandin. And so I got immersed in this stuff for years. And so finally in 1991, we were able to publish this nearly 100-page paper called The Sanskrit Origins of Recent Style Poetry. And basically, we were sanctioned by all the most important Chinese poetry scholars, Stephen Owen, David Connecthes. The very top people said, this is good stuff, Richard Lin. And they were on the Chinese side. So we felt really good about that. Now, that's just background about how I became involved in this business. So one of the first things I noticed from reading the Sanskrit treatises on poetics was dosha. That fairly leaped off the pages for the Chinese notion of Bing is defect. And I was certainly aware of Bing, defect, poetic defect. So some of the names for these defects in Chinese were virtually identical with those in Sanskrit. For example, vyarta, inconsistent or contradictory, and xiangfan, contradiction. Apakrama, inversion, and fanyu, inversion. Kalavirodi, unseasonable. Lojie, unseasonable. Visandhi, disjointedness. Zhili, disjointedness. So these terms, which were all over the place in China among serious poets, and in the Bunkyo Hifuron, they were coming together. And they hadn't existed before with regard to poetry. So this is pretty powerful evidence that something major happened in the way people viewed the writing of poetry after 5th, 6th, 7th century. I'll get into the dating a little bit more later. And so there are many, many other terms like this that are the same in Sanskrit and in Chinese. We also looked at the yamaka, the parallels with yamaka. That's rhyming, or I shall say twinning now. I guess to Gary, twinning. And in Chinese that would be da yun, major rhyme, and xiao yun, lesser rhyme. And then banda, which really was a problem for me, very difficult to grasp. And I invented, I believe this term is totally my own, ligature. I don't know do you use that in Sanskrit? You might consider it, because it worked for me. And all the things that, banda, I don't know bond or fetter or something like that. They didn't work for Chinese in the way that they were being used with the poets, but ligature worked. And I think maybe it would work in Sanskrit too, if you reconsider it. And that was niu, which originally in Chinese meant not. But obviously giving a total new phonological meaning in Chinese after these texts came to China. And it later became one of the most important concepts in Chinese phonology, niu. Now, another student of Meizulin, later, he's about ready to retire from Michigan, University of Michigan, William Baxter's. He wrote his dissertation on niu. And, okay, Baxter's very famous professor of Chinese linguistics. He's about to retire now. Richard Bodman retired probably 10 years ago. Victor Mair is still teaching, and probably is going to teach for 10 more years at least. I don't seem to feel like I'm getting old. And I love teaching. So Baxter wrote his whole dissertation about niu, but I read through it a couple times. I couldn't find a single word about Indian antecedents. But that is so typical of the way people do Chinese studies, and you'll hear more about it as I go on in this talk, is that something that had Chinese, Indian background, when it gets to China, it just becomes Chinese, and nobody cares about whether it has anything to do with India. But I think a lot of times, if you know the Indian background, you're going to understand the Chinese phenomenon better. So you might as well try. That's because a lot of times, if you just know the way things are manifested in China, it's like an incomplete picture or a clouded picture. So that's why when I do my research on Sino-Indian cultural relations, I'm always very stubborn about trying to understand the Indian origins, because it helps me understand the Chinese better. I don't think there are any great walls, great firewalls around Chinese culture. And the Great Wall didn't work anyway, and the Great Firewall doesn't work anyway. And I'm always the one who wants to drill through them or knock them down, because they're fake, they're false, they're wrong. So other similarities we examined were alamkara and upama. But one of the most important distinctions we identified was that between guru and lagu, heavy and light. I haven't heard you guys talking about guru and lagu, but it must be, is it important in Dunedin? Well, sure, it became extremely important in China because it became pingzi. Pingzi is the basic, it means level and slanted, oblique tones. Now, given the enormous typological differences between Sanskrit and Sinitic, it is amazing that Chinese poets could adopt this distinction for their own verse, because basically it has to do with tonal categories, level and oblique. And that's not what it was doing in Sanskrit, which was heavy and light accents, right? Stress. So adherence to these rules of Ping and Zi, which were new around this time, the same time, all this stuff is happening in the early medieval period. This Ping and Zi, which arose in response to Sanskrit poetics, became essential for writing the most esteemed verse forms of the Tang period, and which was the golden age of Chinese poetry. All right, now, we have to face the music. All of us assembled here today in this room are Dunedin devotees. We wouldn't be here if we weren't devotees of Dunedin. But I would not want to mislead you into thinking that Dandin single-handedly led a revolution that transformed Chinese poetry forever. That is impossible for the simple reason that some of the Indic-motivated basic prosodic changes typical of regulated verse began to show up in Chinese poetry already during the 5th century. And some of them were even codified in the famous formulation of the Buddhist layman Shan Yue. Dates are 444 to 513. The 4 tones and the 8 defects. So Shan Yue already wrote down this law of don't contravene these 4, pay attention to the 4 tones. Nobody had been paying attention to how the 4 tones are supposed to match up before. Shan Yue had coterie, he had a salon of people where people discussed Buddhist hymnody. And that's where these ideas were percolating. And he actually talked about the 8 important defects to avoid. Ba Bing, Si Sheng Ba Bing. And that was well before the time of Dandin. Furthermore, this is really going to hurt. You will not find the name Dandin in any Chinese source. I don't think so. And there's no indication of a direct integral translation of his work in Chinese, or even any kind of translation, as I think a real translation. Yet, I have little doubt that Dandin did influence the development of Chinese poetics. And there is a ton of circumstantial evidence in support of that conclusion, adduced by Zulin Mei and me, some of which I have sketched above, but a mountain of which we have elaborated in our long article. I will outline some of it in the remainder of this talk. So how can this be? So much evidence for Dandin's impact, but no Dandin. We have to look at the model for cultural borrowing that is operative in China. Let's take the celebrated monkey hero, Sun Wukong, of the famous novel Journey to the West. I wrote another 100-page paper listing scores of uncanny parallels with Hanuman, who is the monkey hero of Ramayana. But you won't find any overt reference to Hanuman or the Ramayana in pre-modern China, even though, as we heard this afternoon, the Ramayana was translated into Tibetan. And there's also evidence of Ramayana in Khotanese. And I'll have more to say, out in Central Asia. And I'll have more to say about Khotanese later in this talk. I speak till 5:10. Oh boy, I better move fast. So the same holds true for countless other aspects of Chinese culture that were inspired by Indian models in medicine, mathematics, music, art, language, and literature. You see India everywhere, but you don't see the names of Indian authors, artists, musicians, or texts, except when it comes to Buddhism. Then the Chinese who were Buddhist believers paid very close attention to the titles of Indian texts and the names of their authors and translators. Still, regardless of whether there were names of individuals and titles of texts associated with it, there was a huge amount of what I call cultural baggage that came along with Buddhism. So, how did Dandin and his precursors get to China? Well, practically anyone who knew Sanskrit well would have been familiar with their work. if they were like Xuanzang, he went to India and he stayed there for 17 years. So, and he learned Sanskrit really well. So how could he avoid it? And he came back and became the paramount translator of Chinese Buddhist texts into Chinese. So how could he not know Dandin? Andrew mentioned Tocharians. Now, before Xuanzang, the most famous translator of Buddhist texts into Chinese from Sanskrit was Kumarajiva. And Kumarajiva's dates are 344 to 413. His father was a Kashmiri noble, and his mother was a Kuchian, that means Tocharian princess. So he had very good pedigree. And so he was steeped in Sanskrit. He went to Kashmir, he went to northwest India to study Kumarajiva. So he would have learned about Dandin there. And so that's the northern part of the Tarim Basin. You know, the Tarim Basin is the big where the big desert is out in Central Asia. Kucha is on the north. In the south, there's Khotan. So the Kuchians spoke Tocharian. On the south, there were Khotanese in Khotan. And there were monasteries with as many as 10,000 people in them. And it was all Sanskritic. The connections with India were very, very close. You just go over the mountains, you're in India. And so Khotan was like an outpost of Indian civilization in Central Asia. And I wrote a long paper about these Chinese monks who went to Khotan in the year 445 and heard a bunch of stories told there. And I analyzed the forms of the names cited in the stories. Well, anyway, these stories became what was known in Chinese as the Sutra of the Wise and the Foolish, Shen Yu Jing. And that sutra, even though it's in the Buddhist canon, it's kind of weird because it's not a sutra. I mean, it's not really something that the Buddha spoke. It's just a collection of stories. Now, these stories became very important for secular storytelling in China for centuries later. But we know these stories came from India. We can identify some of them. But there's no conspicuous identification that this text came from India. It was just storytelling in Central Asia. So this is the model for transmission that I propose. Cultural elements for sure. But apart from the exceptional case of Buddhist scriptures and Buddhist authors of Buddhist scriptures and translators of Buddhist scriptures, they're not tied up tightly with particular individuals and specific texts. If you want to get a better sense of how this works in practice, I can highly recommend two books by the chairman of this panel, Mair Shahar. In August, he just published a book this year called Oedipal God, the Chinese Nja, and his Indian origins. It's a great achievement. It's very impressive.
But it's not the topic of the...
Yeah, well, it's okay. But you have to know this to understand how things work. And Mair Shahar and John Kishnik edited a book called India in the Chinese Imagination, Myth, Religion, and Thought. That was published at the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2013, and that's based on another conference in Israel, in Tel Aviv, 3 or 4 years ago. So, yesterday, toward the end of our wonderful Havruta, as we reflected on the possibility of diffusion, which, though for a period of about 50 years used to be a dirty word in academia, is now slowly and cautiously making a comeback in a more sophisticated, subtle, and sensitive way, I asked myself how Zulin and I could be so confident that Indian prosody and poetics really did have an impact on the development of Chinese poetry. The sum total of the evidence presented in our article, including statistical data on the use of these rules in actual Chinese poems, makes it obvious that they truly were increasingly operative during the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries and later. But there's an even simpler test. Just go to the appendices of the Mair and May article. There we list poetic figures in Bunkyo Hifuron and in Natya Shastra and in Bamaha and in Dandin. And you will find a strong degree of overlap, not to mention that between the ones in Bunkyo Hifuron and in the Indian text, not to mention the very existence of such lists in India and in China at all. The overlap in the existence of these lists could not have been accidental. I was thinking how someone, perhaps Shanghai or Mair or somebody, could go beyond Mair and May in precise ways to demonstrate this even more convincingly. So Mair and May treated Sanskrit prosody and poetics as a total package. Naturally, we were also interested in whether Bamaha or Dandin, Natya Shastra we rule out because it's too early, and Mamata is too late, 11th century. Whether Bharata or Dandin was more likely to have been the actual primary vector for bringing these rules to China. And we basically came down on the side of Dandin because of his demonstrably internationalist transportability. Plus, also a preponderance of the correspondences were found in Dandin's work. So if somebody, not Mair and May, would like to show whether it was Bamaha or Dandin who had the greater impact on Chinese poetics, just go over those lists of doshas, gunas, yamakas, alamkara in Bunkyo Hifuron, and there are a lot of them, on the one hand, and in Dandin and Bharata on the other hand, and systematically compare them. I have not done this, but I have a very strong hunch that Dandin would come out on top over Bamaha. So I can't do the mirrors. So, my friends, while there may be no smoking gun, well, let me just add this little part. During this period, like the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th century, a sea change took place in the concept of belles lettres in China, where there arose literary criticism and literary theory that treated Chinese literature seriously as literature, not as some kind of appendix to politics or morality. And we have texts like the Wenxin Diaolong, the literary mind in the carving of dragons, which uses the word prajna, by the way. And we have the Shiping, the poetry classification or poetry grades. So these texts were starting to show up just at this time, and this what I call a sea change in Chinese approach to belles lettres. So, okay, we don't have a smoking gun, but there is a gun. And there are plenty of bullet holes. I have no doubt whatsoever that Dandin made his way to China and that he had a big, big impact there. Oh, I'm 2 minutes early.
So you must say something about mirrors.
If you give me 4 minutes, or 5, 4 or 5. Okay. So I had indicated early, and I do need some water, early on in this talk, and had advertised in its title that I would try to say something about the mirror metaphor in Chinese literature. Let me confess that when Yigal and Yael asked me for a title for my talk, I just threw out that in meek desperation. It was an audacious hypothesis that I hadn't really tested. That because it was the title of Dandin's Kavyadarsha, and the mirror metaphor might also have functioned that way in China in post-Dandinian times. And it was obviously in the Bunkyo Hifuron. So I thought, well, it might become a metaphor for later treatises and later writings about poetry in China. I made that assumption. That was the paper I was going to write for this conference. So I looked around, and it didn't really take off in China. That concept of the mirror as a metaphor for Chinese literary, for literature qualities. So my hypothesis was abortive and false. Bronze mirrors have a long history in China, going all the way back to the Bronze Age. Aside from allowing people to gauge how beautiful or handsome or ugly they are, mirrors in China had 4 main functions. Number 1, they were magical. They could collect dew, the yin mirrors, and they could cause fire, the yang mirrors. So we have our yin and yang mirrors. We really do. And those are very ancient. And they were apotropic. They could scare off evil spirits. And they were useful for reflecting on history, mirrors. And the very famous Zizhi Jian. Jian is another word for mirror. That means comprehensive mirror for aid in government. Extremely important history text. But it's later, it's the Song dynasty, so we're already past Bunkyo Hifuron. And we're still using the mirror metaphor for political considerations. And then the closest we could come to is as a mirror as a device for existential introspection. And that was in my favorite early Chinese author, Zhuangzi. And in Xunzi, a very different kind of early Chinese philosopher. And it eventually became a key element of Zen Buddhist imagery, the clean, keeping your soul clean of dust, pure. So my hypothesis didn't pan out. These pre-Dandinian functions already were too deeply rooted. But the very fact that the notion of literary mirror was enshrined in the title of Bunkyo Hifuron, not before and not after, tells us something of equal significance. That it was these Buddhistic Indic canons in the Bunkyo Hifuron, canons for poetic excellence, that were the touchstone for poetic excellence after that time. That was like the pinnacle, and it was a mirror for literature.
So thank you very much for a fascinating talk. And you've noticed that there is a big riddle here, yes? Indian impact, but no specific proof, perhaps, of Dandin. And yet an argument, a very convincing one, I think, for deep impact. So.
There it is. Okay. It's been a long day. Right. Thank you very much for the talk. So just to make this, just to check, so that this is no longer extant in Chinese. Is that correct? It's only in Japanese that this text is.
Well, it's written in Chinese.
Oh, it's written in Chinese.
It was lost. It's not widely circulated in China even now.
Right.
But it was discovered in modern times.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's, I think Bodman was probably the first person who, Japanese scholars had worked on it to a certain extent, but Bodman was the first person to really dig into it, and especially to try to figure out its importance for literature.
Okay, great. I was just wondering about the form as well of the text. So, in terms of when they introduced the doshas, is there a kind of definition of each dosha and examples as we've had in the Sanskrit text?
That's one of the great things about this book, the Bunkyo Hifuron. It has actual specimens of Chinese poetry illustrating each of these defects. I mean, not only the defects, but also there's a section on gunas, the virtues. But that didn't get very much coverage. It didn't seem to be something that people like to talk about in East Asia. But yeah, there were illustrated verses, and that's something that Zulin and I relied very heavily on, is to read the name of the defect or the alamkara, and then see how it's worked out in the illustrative verse. And a lot of times these verses were actual verses that were collected from poetry in that period, but sometimes they were written just for the Bunkyo Hifuron. But I mean, a lot of times they were just poems by very famous poets who had been using these rules. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's just very much of interest, just because I have many colleagues who are scholars in classical Chinese literature and things like that. So I'm already seeing future collaborations that we potentially could do.
You're in Singapore.
I'm in Singapore, so but Singaporean Mandarin, unfortunately. So.
And Singlish.
And Singlish, right?
Yeah, I have a question. I don't know much about Chinese poetry, but I read some things, and it's ancient poetry, and certainly there is Chinese poetry before Dandin. And in that poetry, we already see the use of what we could call alankaras. So my question is, can we...
But they weren't called zhuangyan, which means alamkara.
Okay.
Yeah, and they weren't the same ones.
But
I mean, you could call them alamkara, but go on with your question.
Yeah, the question is, can we really see like a difference in Chinese poetry after, let's say, after the 7th, 8th century?
Absolutely, yes. You can see a qualitative difference in the way they write the poetry, the kind of figures they use. Of course, they're all very smoothly assimilated. The changes aren't jarring, but you can see that they're consciously, for example, avoiding certain clashing of images, for example. And they use similar names for these clashes as are used in Sanskrit. So, yeah, of course, Chinese were using figures of speech in the Book of Poetry, 600 to 100 BC. But they didn't systematize this knowledge in a body of poetics. And not only that, but the kind of poetics that came with India, with Indian influence, along with Buddhism, it's a different kind. The names of these different defects, they identified different kinds of defects that were not identified before. Patrick, I'll call my own, okay?
Okay, I have a quick question about chronology here.
Yeah.
So 804, Kukai brings this to Japan, and it must have been produced sometime before that time, right?
Yeah.
And then you said Shen Yu, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Now, did the 8 defects in 444 to 513, long before the traditional date of Dandin,
and
right?
Bamahal, right?
Right. So could you comment on that? And also, if 804 Kukai is using, so we are talking about Dandin traveling to China within a very short period of time, which is remarkable if it did happen.
Yeah, okay, so did we decide on what Dundin's dates are?
Well, Jagal says 700, right?
700.
Let's say, I mean, we don't know exactly.
But it's not 780. It's toward the 700 sign.
700.
Okay, that's fine. That's plenty of time. Plenty of time. Phew! As I would say in Chinese, 松一口气. Huh?
670 Tibetan.
Oh. Anyway, I'm very relieved to know that Dundin was around 700, because that really makes a much better case for that it was actually Dundin who probably is enshrined in the Bunkyo Hifuron.
Yeah, but what about Yue then? Because he has 8 defects. Where did you get that from?
Okay, great question, Patrick. And that is, okay, so I really believe that these Indic rules were not just restricted to Bamaha and Dundin, but that they were, I don't know what the situation is in India, but there had to be many other prosodists. I don't know why they haven't survived, but okay, I do know that Bamaha cites different kind of predecessors. I think Dundin also does. So it's just like Panini. Okay, Panini is supreme, and everybody talks about Panini, but Panini quotes 100, he even refers to 100 different people before him. So I'm sure that there were lots of people between Natya Sastra. You know, I spent so much time reading Natya Sastra, and I love that book. It's full of everything. But how do you get from Natya Shastra to Dundin, or Bamaha or Dundin? That's a lot of time. There had to be some way, for all those poetics that are already in a nutshell in Natya Shastra, to survive till Bamaha and Dundin's time. And, I mean, there are these names, right? They're the names of people who preceded Bamaha and Dundin. Okay, maybe some of this was just, okay, I'll tell you, when the Chinese Buddhist Sanskrit masters came to China, the Chinese would say, where's the text? You know, like, where's the beef? The Chinese were expecting a text, and the Indian masters would say, huh? The text is here. It's just like when he gets going or he gets going. I mean, the texts are in their brains. So I think that the same thing was happening with these prosody collections, that they were in India. They had to be between Natya Shastra, Bharata, and Bamaha. They could not have survived without some process for preservation and codification. Maybe they didn't get written down. Maybe they did, but all the texts are destroyed. And maybe Dundin survived just because people cared about it, or he was better. He wrote it up better. Maybe he was more felicitous and more cogent. I'm waiting for my ruler to speak.
So, let's see. I want to analytically separate between prosody, defects.
Between what?
Between prosody, questions of prosody, questions of defects, doshas, bings, alankaras, and the image of the metaphor of mirror. These, let's for the sake of the conversation, decide that these are 4 separate issues for just 1 second. I am highly convinced by your article that the prosodical structures of Sanskrit transformed the prosody of recent style poetry in China, in which tonal patterns were mapped on this binary system of Gurun Lagu, convinced, but that happened before Dundin.
Yeah.
And Dandin has nothing. And Dandin has
Doesn't talk
yeah. Dandin has nothing to say about prosody. I mean, he refers his readers to text on prosody. That's not the topic of his book. So, prosody from India influenced prosody and recent style poetry in China before Dandin. Convinced, but we don't see Dandin's smoking gun there. Then Bings, the doshas, we've read together, compared the Bunkyo and Dandin, and there are many more doshas, Bings in the Chinese text that have no precedent whatsoever in the Sanskrit tradition. And there are a few of them that you say, bingo.
Bingo, bing.
But
Bingo.
but it strikes me strange that they needed Sanskrit to think about Kala Viroda, or why. This is like, why wouldn't they be able to think about this themselves? They already had a theory of doshas going. But if they added it, I'm not sure what it added. So that's on the issues of doshas. On the issue of alankaras, that is the big missing piece in the puzzle, because from all the places that we've been describing here, that's the visiting card of Sanskrit poetics, and that's at the heart of Dandin's project. It's these alankaras. It's the main chapter, it's the second paricheda, it's all about alankaras, but really also a lot of the first chapter and a lot of the third chapters are about alankaras, including those yamakas. I want you to comment on the presence of alankaras like the utprekshas that we've been seeing in yesterday's Chevuta, because what I came out convinced of reading these many later renditions of Javanese alankaras is that the authors of these verses knew that they were composing utpreksha when they were composing these verses. It wasn't just that they followed some earlier precedent. They had this code in their mind that this is an utpreksha. I have not seen such things in China. Of course, I don't know Chinese.
Okay, like the kakawin in Indonesia.
Yeah, but I want you to comment on this. The final thing is the issue of adarsha. That I do not know. Maybe my fellow Sanskritists do. I do not know that by the year 800, Dandin's text was called the Kavya Darsha. That I don't know when this happened. I really don't know. The text itself does not call itself the Kavya Darsha, and nor do, but it doesn't exclude the possibility that other commentators or that other people began to call it that way earlier. But analytically speaking, this is a striking resemblance that could be set aside for the purpose of this analytical division. And I want you to comment on these two central things, which is the alankaras and the other bings.
Yeah. Okay, so when I was a graduate student, I remember reading two books. One was by a guy named Quaritch Wales. And it was called, I think, The Indianization of Southeast Asia. And there was a book by, an article in the Harvard Tercentenary collection by a famous Chinese scholar named Hu Shi, and it was called The Indianization of China. Now, the Indianization of Southeast Asia was thorough. And so there's Mahabharata, Ramayana, Buddhist imagery, Angkor Wat is just, it's Hinduism. So Southeast Asia's, there were, when the Chinese pilgrims were going to and from China, sometimes they would stop in Indonesia, Java. And there were monasteries with 10,000 monks there, and Sanskrit learning was very flourishing. So what I'm saying is, Southeast Asia was Indianized to such an extent that they would know these figures. But China's kind of Indianization was very superficial. You know, there were very, very few Chinese, almost none, who learned Sanskrit. Only, probably throughout history, only maybe 100 who ever learned Sanskrit. So they didn't, you know, the mass of people did not know it the way, so they wouldn't know these figures. They wouldn't be immersed in it. But even not in Mongolia or Tibet, because of the nature of Buddhist transmission there, it was so pervasive that there would be greater exposure to Indian culture throughout Chinese society, throughout those societies than there was in China. So it was kind of restricted just to Buddhism, but very highly Sinicized. So that, I think that's why the Alamkara really couldn't work the same way in China, but the concept could. You know, in fact, that word, embellishment, ornament, is very widespread in Buddhist thought and imagery in China, but specific images not. So I think that's the answer to your first question. Please repeat your second question.
Why would there arise a need to add like a selection of doshas from?
Oh, you mean extra doshas?
Extra doshas.
Oh.
Don't you have enough doshas already?
No. 8's not enough, and 10's not enough. And so, you know, one thing about China that Chinese is good at, it's like elaboration and proliferation. So, and also, you know, gradually they would lose, I mean, very quickly actually, they would lose sight of the fact that this had an Indian basis at all. So they would say, we can just run with this, and they did. So that doesn't pose a problem, I think, why they started, and why wouldn't they? They wanted to invent something that these defects that suited their own language better. Because I actually think all of those Indic things were really like Procrustean beds imposed upon Chinese, so they didn't fit. But it's just, I think, one of the most amazing transfers of cultural restraints in history, that these things could come from India and be applied to Chinese at all, because Chinese language and Sanskrit are so different. So different. The script, the structure, the grammar, the syntax, everything. Somebody back there had a question.
Thank you for your very intriguing talk, and since you said some words so captivating about some old professors, I thought that I might just briefly mention one more name. Siegfried Linhardt had some time ago suggested to translate the term Banda with in German with Bindung, so binding in English. So it goes to, it is in the context of magical binding, magical captivation, and that's the basic meaning of these figures, which Dandin does not specify as bandhas. The term bandha is used actually for the first time, to my knowledge, by Ratna. So he defines Gomutrika, Ardhabrahma, and Sarvatobhadra as bandhas, the bindings. It goes well with your note, actually, so I just wanted to contribute this note.
Yeah, but I was trying to think of a word in English that would fit the way it became used phonologically in Chinese, and ligature worked well. I just wanted to mention one last name that I forgot. Mézulin had been a mathematician, and that reminds me of our friend from France. But he was exposed to Roman Jakobson and became like a disciple of Roman Jakobson, and that's why he got into Chinese literature and structural linguistics. I just wanted to mention that. I think time, well, there. Last question.
So, how
Cornell
many alankaras are there? And how many alankaras are there, or whatever the equivalent, and do they proliferate? Because in India, it's alankaras that grow and grow and grow and have a natural tendency for profusion, and doshas not so much. I mean, people add a few occasionally, but
Not so many. The doshas are greater in number. I mean, it's kind of easy to, it's catchy to just like, oh, there's a defect, there's a defect. Like, you know, how do we, you can complain about poetry very easily in China and say, this guy wrote bad. That's why we have this concept of shiping, which means grading poetry. And if you get put in the third class, forget it. And so, I mean, it's easy to say, this guy made a mistake, and here's the mistake he made. But in terms of these very subtle different kinds of alamkaras, I think it's harder to deal with.
But if they're starting from a Dundan-esque base, it would say something very different about the proclivities of Indian and Chinese poetic culture.
See, I don't think they were starting from a Dundan-esque base. I think they got a big push in the middle.
But what's the evidence for that on the Alankara side specifically? That's what I'm not getting.
Well, and one good thing about the Alankara is that it's not just in the prosodists, in the the poetic specialists. It's also in Buddhist treatises on language. So I mean, we can deal with that a lot because they talk about alankaras of the body, but also alankaras of speech in the Buddhist treatises.
Yeah, but do they have samasukti and akshepa and things like that? Are there recognizable equivalents for things that aren't simile and metaphor? So everybody has simile and metaphor.
Yeah, these you can equate them with Sanskrit terms, but somebody has to do it, like Shanghai or not me. Okay. I've done my bit.
Thank you for a wonderful talk.